So, then let us all be monsters. Where does that come from? Well, as Bo mentioned, last year I finished work on the Encyclopedia of Action Research. And my very good friend David Greenwood, who is a scholar at Cornell University, said that he didn't much like the Encyclopedia Britannica as a model for the encyclopedia, but that he quite liked the encyclopedia that the French philosopher Denis Diderot had done in the 1800s. So, to tell you the truth, I didn't know much about Diderot's encyclopedia, so I had to go find out something about it. And in finding something about it, I found this quote. So this is, Diderot said, "What is a monster? A being whose survival is incompatible with the existing order." So as an action researcher, I feel like something of a monster. And after talking to Bo and Richard and Carolina and the people here, I realized that they're monsters as well. And I'm assuming that many of you are monsters too. So the question then before us is the following. What's a monster to do? How do those of us who feel incompatible with the existing social order, how do we respond to that challenge? And here I look to the work of Kurt Levine, who is one of the founders of Action Research, who said, if you want to truly understand something, try to change it, which is really sort of the basis of the work that we do as action researchers. Before I talk about action research specifically, I want you to have two, we said in the title that we were going to sort of talk about tough issues. And I'm not going to tell you about the refugee crisis, but I want you to be mindful of that as we talk about action research and be thinking about how might action research help us in this moment of crisis to begin to deal with some of the issues facing the world and facing your own community here in Malmo. I was reading in the Guardian newspaper in the UK that Sweden is accepting per capita more refugees in the current crisis than any other country, who are actually resettling here. And something like 190,000 this year and somewhere between 100 and 170,000 next year, which is commendable, truly commendable. But it also sounds to me like there's some, resistance and anxiety about that, which is certainly understandable as well. So, again, I'm not going to tell you, that would be presumptuous, what you should be doing in response to this crisis. But I want you to be thinking about that as we talk about action research and thinking about how action research might be used as a tool to begin to help understand the nature of this crisis and how we might develop some responses to it. So that's one tough issue. The second tough issue that I want you to be thinking about is food insecurity and the global climate change. These are obviously not unrelated to one another. I just came back, actually, yesterday, I arrived here from a short visit to South Africa, where I was attending the World Congress of Action Research, and had a chance to visit Soweto. And they've had a very poor winter in the sense that there's been no rain, and it's very dry, and they're having a hard time raising crops, and many of the animals are dying as a result. Not the wild animals, but the cattle that people count on to survive in terms of food. And that's the kind of situation that also leads to more refugees. Maybe not people fleeing war, but fleeing famine. And as we look at sort of the increasing global climate problem, these kinds of issues are not going to, they're not going to improve. We're going to have more people moving, more people desperate, and it's a real challenge for us to be thinking about how can we be active in trying to address these problems. That's one of the things that first drew me to action research, is the possibility of actually engaging in problem solving rather than just studying a problem, actually trying to somehow be involved in finding solutions to that. So again, just be thinking about this as we talk a little bit about action research. So what is the purpose of research? if you think about quantitative research, and I was brought up in a very traditional psychology program where because I taught graduate statistics, everybody thought I must be okay. And on the other hand, I was doing community organizing at night. And they finally found out that I was, up to something. And I had to go find action research as a way of sort of resolving that problem for myself. But I was, taught quantitative methods. And the basic purpose of quantitative methods is really to measure things, right? Just to understand the scope of things, to be able to count and measure. Qualitative research is about making meaning. Action research is about creating change. What my quantitative colleagues would tell you is that there's sort of a hierarchy and that quantitative methods is at the top. I would flip it over and say that in fact we do need to measure things and we do need to make meaning, but then we need to use that information, that knowledge, to somehow create change. And that's where action research comes in. What am I going to do if I need to get a drink of water? Am I going to electrocute myself? Okay, well, this might be a more interesting talk than you thought. Okay, so what is action research? This is the definition that Peter Reason and Hilary Bradbury came up with in the first issue of the first edition of the Handbook of Action Research. They said it's a participatory, democratic process concerned with developing practical knowing in the pursuit of worthwhile human purposes. So I think there are a couple important elements in that. One is that it's democratic. Most forms of research are very hierarchical, very expert-driven. Action research, on the other hand, is intended to be very participatory and collaborative and to honor the knowledge that people bring to a process. And it's also very practical. It's one of the things that drew me to this, is as I said, I like to solve problems. I like the research that I do to make a difference, and action research is really focused on that. It's not that we gather knowledge and then turn that knowledge over to someone else to create change. We are expected to be active agents in change ourselves. And the idea that, we are really working toward a human flourishing. And I would say more than just human, global, environmental, human, we see that all together. One of the things that I think is kind of tricky when you start doing action research is that there are all these different terms that get used to describe what are basically a related family, I would say, of research methodologies. The reason for that is that I think in every discipline, you had people who were doing more conventional forms of research who got dissatisfied and went searching for some other way of operating that was going to be more satisfying to them and that was going to address the need that they felt for making a change. So you had people in healthcare, in education, in organization development, in international development, all coming up with independent kind of ways of rethinking research that was more engaged, that was more collaborative, that was more change-oriented. So you've got all these different terms, which makes, like keyword search is really challenging because you never know what to call it, right? So this is just a few. And I decided yesterday after I got Beau's book that I should add collaborative media to the end. So there you are. Some people think of action research as a methodology. Some people think of it epistemologically. I would say that the one thing that brings all of those different traditions of action research together is actually a shared values stance. This comes from that article that Beau mentioned, the first article in the journal Action Research that we did. And the way we did this article was that we queried all of the members of the editorial board and asked them why they do action research. And then we sort of synthesized their answers and wrote the article based on that. We did that for two reasons. One is that as a new journal, many people coming to it didn't know what action research was. So we wanted to introduce action research. But we also wanted people to understand that this journal was going to be different than other academic journals, that the members of the editorial board weren't unknown entities, but we wanted to have a relationship with readers and contributors to that journal. We wanted them to understand the passion that we had for this work. And so we did this article. And this is just a short quote from that article where we talk about the values that we share. And those are a respect for people and the knowledge and experience they bring to the research process, a belief in the ability of democratic processes to achieve positive social change, and a commitment to action. Okay, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. One of the things that you'll see about action research is that the key part, particularly, I define myself as an action researcher, but particularly as a participatory action researcher would be sort of my own home trajectory as an action researcher. And the key to beginning and sustaining that process is developing relationships in communities to partnership. So you sort of begin by forming the partnership. The second stage is assessing community strengths and dynamics, identifying priorities, goals, and research questions, designing and conducting the research. And again, all of this is happening as a collaborative process, right? This is not an expert coming in and doing this on behalf of or about people in communities, but rather in collaboration and partnership with people in communities who own the process of research and the knowledge that's generated and are then empowered to somehow use that knowledge to create change in their own communities. Feeding back and interpreting research results, disseminating and translating research findings, and this is one we'll talk a little bit about what does that mean in practice, and then finally, maintaining and sustaining and evaluating those partnerships. These should be sustained relationships over, a long time, where it's oftentimes seen as an iterative process where there's cycles of action and reflection that go on together with your community partners. So what are the roles of the action researcher? This slide, this idea came out of not a conversation. I had a conversation one of my students had with one of my colleagues at the University of Cincinnati. And this colleague was telling my doctoral student that she shouldn't do action research because it was lazy research. Oh, I was really annoyed, which isn't the word I was going to use. So I got to thinking about, well, what are the roles of the action researcher, right? We're not just there to collect data, analyze data, and write papers and publish them. Depending on the situation, sometimes you're an organizer, sometimes you're an educator, facilitator, data analyst, advocate, mediator, networker, witness, accompanist, strategist, provocateur, publicist, translator, and friend. And I actually added friend just this morning when I was thinking about this, because I think too often we think that, the whole idea of objectivity and value neutrality that's supposed to be sort of so important in research denies the centrality of human relationships. I have very, very dear friends who are my research partners. I care about them, I care about their families, I grow up with their children, that notion of being in relationship with others is a key aspect of doing action research, and I think one of the things that I value most about it as well. So how do you go about developing these partnerships? Any of you recognize this photograph? Do you know what this is? Okay, so you're going to learn something new, even if it's just this. Timber sports. My son is a forester, and when he was in college, he was on the timber sports team. And so I have a collegiate athlete as a son. And we went down to a timber sports meet, whatever they're called. And this particular event is the water boil. I don't know how it works in Swedish. In English, watching water boil is kind of a metaphor for boring, but this is really a very exciting event. In the water boil, what happens is you have two people, and they get 2 pieces of wood and a little tiny hatchet, a can of water, and 3 matches. And then the buzzer goes off, and they have to set about lighting a fire, boiling the water in as short a time as possible. There are 2 people on the team. One of them starts chopping up wood madly. One of them is putting it into a little pyramid to getting it all set up, putting up the frame, getting the can on there. Then they light it, and then they throw themselves on the ground on either side of the fire and start blowing back and forth. So one blows and the other backs up, and then the other blows and the other one backs up. It's beautifully choreographed. These 2 women, who won hands down, and I have to say were on my son's team, did this in less than 3 minutes. But it all depends on a very well-honed partnership. So what are the aspects of developing a partnership? Well, it depends on the nature of the community. Oftentimes I think what we do is we think, well, I'll just go into the community and do research. But communities are not always at the same place, you know. There are lots of different dynamics that go on in communities that really affect how we're going to go about developing and sustaining those partnerships. And I think it's important, before we go into communities, to be thinking about what is the nature of this particular community and how am I best going to approach, you know, working in this setting in order to be successful in developing a collaboration. Sometimes you have an established community, a group of people who have already gotten organized, already know each other, and they come to you sometimes with a question, and really, then, you know, half of your work is done. But that's really very rare. Sometimes you have an emergent community where people understand that they have a shared concern or interest, but they haven't really coalesced. So that's where part of your job is really to be an organizer. And that's sort of, I actually came out of doing community organizing rather than, you know, coming out of, you know, I was sort of a scholar on the one hand, but a community organizer on the other. Sometimes you have a potential community. People don't even know each other yet, but maybe share a concern or an interest, and part of your job is to bring those people together to begin a conversation about how they might work collaboratively with you. Sometimes you're working in a hierarchical community, and that's something you really have to, you know, you always have to be aware of issues of power when you're doing this kind of work. Your own power, which, you know, I know a lot of researchers who I think would just as soon pretend like they don't have any. You know, oh, I'm just, you know, on an equal basis with people. Well, that's just not true. You know, we come into communities as people coming from a university, as people with education, as people with resources, and as far as I'm concerned, it behooves us to take all of those resources, all of that power, and use it as best we can to the benefit of our community partners, not to pretend like it doesn't exist. But when you're working in communities, oftentimes you'll see, you know, there are people within that community. You know, it's not like you just get all the stakeholders at the table and then everything's going to work out. You need to really think about who in this community has power, how is that power being used? Are all the voices being heard? Are some of the voices silenced? If so, how do I bring all the voices in this community to the table to have people be able to express their concerns? So you really need to be mindful of that when you're doing this kind of work. Sometimes you're working in a divided community. You know, you have people on two sides of an issue, both of whom may have very legitimate concerns, and they need to, all of that needs to be honored. I have a good friend, Victor Friedman, who does a lot of work in Israel, and he teaches in a school that has both Arab and Jewish Israeli students, and he chooses to work there specifically because he's trying to help the students in his school and his community more broadly to find ways of bridging differences. But, you know, that's often very, very difficult. I mean, even if he can be successful in his own right, larger political forces in the community often kind of drive people apart. So it's a real challenge to work in divided communities. And finally, sometimes you're working in a transient or involving community. You know, people who work with the homeless, for example. It's very difficult to establish ongoing partnerships and sustaining a collaboration when the very people that you're trying to work with may be coming in and going out of whatever the community context you're working in is. So we need to be mindful about what the nature of community is as we get started with this. Okay, so that's the research. Now where's the action? This is a cartoon from my friend Yolande Wadsworth's book about action research. And the first person is saying, but if it's not participatory research, what is it? Dictatorial inaction research? Or maybe alienated sedentary research? Or autocratic twiddle your thumbs research? I don't know. So where's the action? Well, action research, change can happen at multiple levels, and hopefully in any project, it's happening at multiple levels simultaneously, right? You have individual level change, where the people who are participating in the research with you are becoming more confident or developing skills, maybe, you know, developing relationships, dealing with their own problems or their own issues. So hopefully there will inevitably be some kind of individual change happening. But at the same time, you hope that there's some group level change happening, that people are coming together, are developing more cohesiveness of the group, are understanding one another's positions within that group. So you're having that. But then you've got, the possibility of change all the way to the international level. And we're going to talk in a minute about an approach to research that I think is particularly powerful in hopefully bringing about larger scale kinds of change. And that's systemic action research. Systemic action research, a number of people have written about this. This happens to be a book by my friend Danny Burns, who's at the Institute for Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. And he talks about this idea of systemic action research as a strategy for whole system change. A lot of action research projects, and very good, very meaningful action research projects, are very localized. You will work in a group, in a community, help them to identify a problem and come up with some way of at least dealing with it. But it's not going to change the larger structures that continue to reinforce systems of inequality and inequity. And what Danny says is that if we want to begin to do that, if we want to change, for example, health inequality on a global scale, little isolated local projects are not going to accomplish that. We need to have what he calls systemic action research, the idea that we have small projects going on in many, many places or in many parts of a community that are linked as a kind of learning network to support each other and to learn from each other. And that the way he describes it, he was actually at this conference that I was at this week, and he talks about the idea that we're constantly trying to sort of roll a ball up a hill. And you're pushing, and you're making progress, and that sort of the larger forces that would see things stay as they are have a vested interest in making that impossible for you. They're going to try to find a way of getting that ball to roll right back down in the valley where it was. And that what we need to do is we need to get to a tipping point where that ball sort of rolls over the top and change happens. And his contention, and I agree with him, is that this idea of systemic action research allows us to bring the forces of all those projects together and hopefully provide enough impetus to begin to create larger scale change. So Danny defines that in this way. He says, if action research is to be an effective political tool, then it has to move beyond the single local group, team, or organization to work across organizations, networks, and partnerships on multiple sites and at multiple levels. And I want you to be thinking of that particularly in terms of the two tough questions that I posed at the beginning about the refugee crisis and about global climate change. So how do we create these systemic action research processes that might help us to really tackle those tough issues in some meaningful way? Before you even get started, though, I think it's important as action researchers to begin by developing a personal ethical stance. Because once you get out in communities, I don't know what the human subjects research process is. I think it's very different actually here than it is in the United States. But sort of existing systems for guiding research ethics are pretty limited in scope. And what happens when you enter, you can't predict what's going to happen. In a traditional, conventional study, you could say, well, I'm going to, have my, experimental group and my control group, and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to collect this kind of data, and then we're going to, you can sort of predict what's going to happen before you get started. In action research, you get out in a community, and, I tell my students to expect the unexpected. Something is going to happen that you did not anticipate. And we need to be prepared to act in a way that's going to be consistent with our ethics in that moment when things go terribly awry. And they do, right? So I think it's important to be thinking, even before we get out there, about what kind of values we hold most dear and how those values inform our practice as researchers. Rather than being value neutral, we are deeply embedded in our value system as action researchers. So this is where I stop talking and you start working. Okay, and one other critical aspect of action research is I didn't mention is post-it notes. I don't know how we did this stuff before post-it notes, to be honest with you. Okay, so hopefully I have enough. You can all share. I thought I had some more. If you don't have enough, and maybe you won't, take two. We'll pass them around. So hang on. Aha! Well, I think I just unplugged myself. Yeah, help. Hugo, you better come and help me here with this. Well, Hugo is getting me attached. I'm going to give you all, thank you very much. Here, you're in charge of post-it notes. I just made you in charge. Did you pass them all up? Everybody get some? So everybody take two. Here, sorry about that. No, you go right ahead. Yep. Okay. So did everybody get some? So, and if they're extras, you can take 3. I'll be really generous because I don't want to have to carry them back to the United States. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about what 3 values or ethical principles are most important to you in terms of informing your own research practice. And this is a list that I put together that just has lots of different ones. It's not inclusive, all inclusive. So if you don't see something up there that's important to you, feel free to add it. There may be values that you see as important that are in Swedish that you want to include. I will tell you that I included one in there just for you for today. So see if you can find it. Haha, yes. Lagom. I probably mispronounced that. But this is a word I learned from my friends Gunilla and Lars, which seems actually very pertinent to doing action research, and sort of dealing with the kind of problems we're going to deal with. If I understand it correctly, the idea that, enough is enough and you don't need more than that. And it's sort of about, balance and sharing and all kinds of values that are really important. Am I getting that about right? So maybe that's one that is important to you. Maybe it's not. But choose 2 values that you think are really important. Then I want you to write one of those values on each post-it note, right? And then I want you to define it. If you want to define it in Swedish, that's okay. If you want to define it in English, that's okay too. I don't really care because I don't have to understand it. You do. So write them on the post-it note. Write what the value is. And then write down what your definition of that value is. This is very tricky. Okay, hopefully that's not going to do anything terrible. Okay, so once you get that done, this also gets people up and moving a little bit. And I realize this is going to be difficult because everybody's on these great tiered things. But I want you to come down and I want you to stick them up here on the whiteboard. All right? And we're not going to take very much time to do this because I've got lots of other things I want you to do as well. So you got 2 minutes, starting 2 minutes ago. Did you have questions from? Okay. Fair enough. Do you know Elvis's song about the blue suede shoes? I really like those. Okay, so as you get them done, if you want to pass them across, that might be easier. Why don't you pass them across to the person on the aisle, and then the person on the aisle is responsible for coming down and putting them on the board. This is the cost to those of you who took the aisle seats. You got to do the work. Come on. Yep, just stick them up there. But then as you're sticking them up there, I want you to organize them. All right? So however you see fit. And those of you who are waiting for this to all happen, you might take a couple of minutes and just talk to each other, whoever the person is next to you, about what values did you write down, why did you write down those values, how do you see those values somehow informing the way you want to practice as a researcher. And I want the most compulsive person in the room to stay up here and, help with the organization here as we do this. You know who you are. Yep. And if you have ideas on how to do that, you go right ahead. So if you haven't finished up, please do that in the next, couple seconds and get them down here so we can get them included. Okay, so you organizer people, you've got another 10 seconds here to get things finished up. By the way, I said that this was sort of an initial process of developing a personal values stance, right? Which is important. But as you'll see, part of the way this works is also then as a collaborative process so that a group that you're working with can begin to develop a shared values stance that can serve as sort of a touchstone for thinking about the ethical implications of the work that you're doing together. Okay, so all right, nobody move. Okay, you can move to do that. Now, hang on, don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. You're staying here. Okay, what's your name?
Maria.
Maria and Yana and Zina. Okay, so Maria and, is that what you said?
Yeah.
And Yana and Zina. Your job is to sort of take us through the map, right? So you've got the first third, you've got the middle third, and you've got the last third, all right? So we'll let you get started. Just take us through sort of what you see as being the main, these are all supposed to be organized. Tell us about the clusters you see. What are the sort of the main themes that you see coming out of all of these different Post-it notes that you see, okay?
And I should take this side.
You take that side, and you're going to take the middle, and then you're going to take the end, all right? So take a second and give it, see what you think.
And I'm not sure if this is finished.
No, that's all right. It's as finished as it's going to get for the moment. Okay, so what have you got? Here, Bo's got a microphone for you, so.
Yeah. Community spirit, social responsibility, humor, open-mindedness. Well, this, is it on? Så, nu funkar det.
There you go.
Well, this side seems to be about a lot about community and trust, group spirit.
Great. How about the middle third?
This part is about love.
No,
it's
excellent.
not. Respect, trust, honesty, and critical thinking. I think there's something here.
Fantastic.
Yes. Hello.
Okay, Zena, you take it.
Creativity has landed in this corner, along with a bit of equality. And this looks like a hash of things that have not found its home yet.
Okay. So what's an oddball one out there?
Lagom is here.
Oh, excellent,
Yes.
excellent. Well, I'm glad I put it on there then. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you all very much. Well done. You can give that back to Bo. I love the fact that love comes up on this, right? How often in the context of doing the research do we acknowledge the fact that love is such an important aspect of what we do? So again, this is meant both to sort of help us to, I sometimes tell my students, it's like, how many of you do dance or yoga or anything like that? Any of you? Well, if you do yoga or dance, people always talk about strengthening your core muscles, right? And that by strengthening your core, you can move more flexibly. And I think that part of what this exercise does is to sort of help us to strengthen our ethical core so that we really ground ourselves in the values that are most important to us. So, as I say, when we get out there and something unexpected happens, hopefully we can respond in the moment in a way that is consistent with those values. So, I gave a talk recently, this past spring, in the Philippines, and I had them do an exercise similar to this, and I asked them about values that were important in their own language, as I did with you, to ask you, to include ones that weren't in English but may be more appropriate to you. And one of the values that one of the participants, Cyril Belvis, mentioned was, any of you speak Tagalog? Oh, good. So how do you pronounce that really? Because I was about to butcher it. Thank you very much. And then I said, well, Cyril, what does that mean? And he said, well, it means sort of fumbling. And I thought it was so interesting. And I asked him afterwards, I said, would you email me more about this? Because I think this is such a great value. And he emailed me and gave me permission to use this and said he would define this as, he said it implies openness to the surprise of our findings may reach, humility in front of our respondents, and playfulness towards serendipity. Isn't that extraordinarily beautiful? And for me, it just captures exactly what action research would be like. And I didn't even know that until he gave me this new word for it. So I share it with you. Okay, now what we normally do when we use this process is the next step is to create, this is like a grid where you put the values down this one side. And then at each stage of the research process, you pose yourself a question, you and your group, how will I know? How will I recognize that I'm enacting the values that I said were important or that we said were important at each stage of that process? We actually have our students do this as part of their dissertation research, and it should be included in their dissertations as a reflection on what kind of ethical challenges did they encounter in doing the research and how did they respond to those ethical challenges. Okay, now what I want to do, what time am I going to be? Okay, we're doing good. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but when we did the encyclopedia that Bo mentioned, there were over 100 different methods and methodologies included in that encyclopedia. Because we're, you know, and we're perfectly happy to use traditional quantitative methods. You know, we do surveys, we sometimes use biomedical research. You know, we're very open-minded about what kind of data we use. The difference is who decides what the data has to be, who collects it, and who owns it. But we've also developed a lot of methods specifically for use in action research processes. So what I want to do today, and this is, like I say, just a few of the many that are available, is talk about a couple that I thought you might find particularly interesting. And some of them I want to emphasize, not this one particularly, but some of the others we'll talk about in a minute, I thought were maybe more appropriate to people who are doing design and media kinds of stuff, so you can see what you think. Have any of you used Fishbone Diagrams or Ishikawa diagrams? The reason I like these is that they're easy, fun, and cheap. What's not to like, right? So I need everybody to this is another, like, do-it-yourself. Get out a piece of paper or share a piece of paper with somebody else. If the person next to you doesn't have one, you can do these together. Okay, or use another Post-it note. That's right, Richard. Okay, so what I need you to do is to draw a fish skeleton, right? It doesn't have to be as elaborate as this, but there will be a prize for the best one. So draw a fish skeleton. And then I want you to label the head of the fish skeleton as the problem or issue that you want to address. It could be the refugee crisis, it could be food insecurity and climate change, or it could be a problem that you're dealing with in your own research context. Let's not have anything too personal, because we might want to talk a little bit about it. But draw a fish skeleton, and then, like I say, label the head of the fish as the problem that you want to address. Okay? And then each of the bones is then what factors contribute to this problem, right? So, for instance, if we're talking about food insecurity, what contributes to food insecurity? What factors contribute to that? Pollution, okay, so that would be one of the bones. What else contributes to food insecurity? Multinationals, yeah, what else? Weather. So all of those are going to be bones on the fish skeleton with a head that says food insecurity, right? So these are kind of the directions that I've just given you. And you can get very carried away. I mean, you can sort of, you know, once you get one fish done, you can choose a bone and then do another fish about that. A friend of mine, Paul Noon, called it the shoal of, what did he call it? The shoal of insecurity or something. I can't remember. Oops, hang on. Okay. So what did y'all come up with? Anybody want to volunteer a fish for us? Are you still working? Well, I'm going to be school teacherly, and I'm going to just call on whoever looks like most anxious about getting called on in a second if somebody doesn't volunteer. This is what happens when you sit in the front row. What have you got?
I'm just starting.
Okay.
I started the problem of pseudo-participation.
Pseudo-participation?
Yes.
Yeah, well, how would you define pseudo-participation?
Where those who initiate a participation structure it in such a way that it appears to be real participation, but is actually manipulated or
Gotcha,
otherwise.
gotcha. Have you ever read Sherry Arnstein's work on the letter of citizen participation? That's what that sounds like to me. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this, and this was like back in the 1960s, right? I think the late 1960s, she published this paper where she looks at sort of levels of what, I think pseudo-participation is a good way of describing it, from levels of tokenism where we say, we really want to have, what does my dean talk about? Like, we're going to do a listening tour, right? So the administrators at my university will go around and, put their, like, concerned administrator faces on and listen meaningfully and, and then they write a report that has nothing to do with anything we said. Is that kind of pseudo-participation that you're talking about? Yeah. So what do you think contributes to pseudo-participation?
I think a very conventional education, which shapes experts in a particular way.
Right.
They think they're the expert and others are not.
Right. Could you hear this? Yeah, so what she said was that one of the contributing factors to pseudo-participation is a conventional education, where we define some people as experts and some people as those who should be listening to experts. Is that a fair way of putting it? Good, okay. Anybody else want to say something about your fish? Did anybody choose to use either the refugee crisis or global insecurity or climate change as or were you working on things of your own? Green growth. Okay, so what? Okay, good. So what contributes to? I mean, did you do it as a positive thing, or because you can also do this sort of like what would contribute to a positive outcome? It doesn't have to be a problem. You could. One of the things about action researchers is we take any method and we change it up every time we do anything, right? So how did you approach this?
Rather critical, I would say. The terms are not all there. Some are a bit more neutral, but I can just mention a few, such as individualism, consumption, production, ambivalence, freedom, hypocrisy, tokenism.
Okay, so did y'all get that? Hypocrisy, tokenism, individualism. What else was on there? Production, consumption are all things that are... Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so again, this is a really good way to get a group started thinking about a problem. Again, it's completely cheap. Most action researchers, we're going into communities that don't have a lot of resources to do this kind of work. So doing something that people can get their heads around really quickly, that's sort of fun, so it's not very intimidating, because sometimes you get people thinking, oh my God, I'm going to have to do research, and people don't feel confident or competent to do that. So if you can a lot of methods you'll see, things like, and we'll talk a bit about this later, World Cafe or group level assessment, they seem to be very informal. I sometimes use the metaphor of jazz, that doing action research is like playing jazz, like we heard, because it seems as if it's just sort of happening effortlessly, But when you really look at it, there's a very deep theory and practice and training embedded in that allows it to look as if it's just sort of happening. And things like fishbone diagrams actually have a very deep purpose. It's just it doesn't seem like it's all that difficult or challenging, so people will engage with you in doing that. Now, this is another very popular method that we use in action research called photo voice. Photo voice, digital storytelling that we'll talk about in just a second, are ways of using images to try to understand a problem or a issue in a community. And I chose this picture in particular to help us think about sort of the refugee crisis as a tough issue that we're dealing with. Normally, Normally what would happen is you would be a group of people who had identified an issue that was of concern to you. I would ask you to go out and take pictures that represented that issue for you, to bring those images back to the group, to select one of those images, to write about it, or to say a story about it, depending on what group you're working with. And then the group would do a group analysis of those images. And then those images and the stories that accompany this provide data about the issue and can also be used as advocacy materials and policy making tools. Images are very powerful, as you all know, since this is the kind of work that you do. And a process that has been developed in order to analyze, sort of do group analysis of these images, sometimes referred to as the showed process because of the sort of starting letters that are embedded in the process, right? So this is what happens after the images have been taken, after people have sort of come back with that. This is the process that's used to do the analysis part of photo voice. So the first part is, what do you see here? An observation component. So if you, without trying to think about the meaning, how would you just describe what you see in this image? Anybody want to hazard a description? Okay, good. Yep, I mean, it says police right there, and you can see the people behind, women, children, people sort of carrying belongings with them, right? What is really happening here? How would you interpret this image? That's interesting. That's an interesting point, yeah.
So there is not really,
You don't see people sort of pushing forward or anything like that, yeah. Other interpretations?
Policeman seems a little helpless
Yeah.
because of the way he put his hands upwards.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's not stopping with force, but kind of
Mm-hmm.
trying to find the solution,
Yeah.
not know what to do.
Yeah. And just, in the stories that you read in the paper about, the feeling of being overwhelmed that I think many of the authorities feel in the face of all of this. Okay, how does this relate to our lives? How would we contextualize this image? How does this relate to your lives as people here in Sweden who are, now on the receiving end of all of this refugee crisis? Anybody have thoughts about that? Yeah. Right. So it's having a direct impact here in the community because these very people are arriving at the train station here and requiring help. Yeah. Other thoughts about how this affects your lives and how, what the context is here? Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think one of the things that's makes us have such impact is that, and again, I'm preaching to the choir here, but images have such an emotional impact on us, and we see this image with, desperate families with their children, and it doesn't just seem like numbers anymore, it seems like, like human lives that we need to take seriously and care about in some way, Other thoughts about the contextualization? So the next step then is to think about, why does this situation, concern, or strength exist? How do we think about the political implications of this? And this is where we really begin to move into sort of the action component to really begin to try and understand, what are the political, economic, social forces that are creating this problem? And that then is going to bring us into thinking about action. What can we do to improve the situation or to enhance these strengths? And that's where, in an action research process, we're going to begin to move to trying to articulate some action that we're going to take to try to address the problem, whatever that might be. Any questions about this photo voice process before we move on? Any questions from our friends online? How are they all hanging in there? Yeah.
I just wonder, where would you place materialization?
How do you define materialization?
Yeah, I'm asking you about how would you, I'm just proposing the notion of the material, and where would you place this, or how would you?
I'm not understanding how you mean materialization. You mean, like, how are we making it real, or? Oh, well, I guess I would say, if I understand correctly, I guess what I would say is I would think of it as part of action. How are we, actually grappling with this in a real sense? Just to give you an example about how this has been used. Actually dealing with refugee issues, I used to do a lot of work in family literacy with recently arrived refugee families in the United States. And one of the problems that we saw is that there was, and I think this is something that's happening here as well, if I understand correctly, a lot of uncertainty about who people were, some resistance to who these people were. They didn't look like members of our community in Louisville, Kentucky. Young Sudanese men, Somali Bantu people. And so we did a project where we had the refugee families go out and take pictures about what they contributed to our community. And then they brought those pictures back in, and we asked them to either write in their own language, write in English if they were proficient enough by then, or to speak if they weren't literate in their own language, which was true for some of the, particularly the Somali Bantu families, the story behind the image. And we then used those stories as literacy materials. I don't know how many of you have read the work of Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, but he did a similar kind of process that's described in his book Pedagogy of the Oppressed and some of his other work, where you rather than using sort of literacy materials that are totally divorced from someone's experience, you use their own lives and their own practice and their own concerns to develop materials to allow people to develop literacy. And then what we did was we took those stories, both in their original languages and in English, and we blew up the images, and we took them around to different parts of the community. In this case, it was through Catholic Charities, so it was to different Catholic churches in the city, and had events where we invited members of those parishes to come along with the refugees and to read their stories and to meet them, so that, again, once you sort of meet people and you understand their stories and you understand for all of these people the deep tragedies that they had survived and the hopefulness with which they came to the United States to try to find a new life, it began to shift the way people perceived who those people were, and to begin to build some bonds between the families and the other members of the community. So it can be a very powerful tool in that regard. Digital storytelling is sort of an expanded way of doing photo voice. So instead of just using still images, here we're using video, or video of some kind. This particular instance is a study that was done in Buenos Aires, and is a form of what's called youth participatory action research, which we've got something about a little bit later, where we're engaging young people as research partners. And in this particular instance, the young people were people whose families lived on the garbage dump in Buenos Aires. So you can sort of see in the back of this image, around the edge of the image, little shacks, which are the homes of these young people and their families. And their families earn their living by taking material out of the dump that they can salvage in some way. And what the initial problem was that these young people weren't attending school. And when they approached the young people all said, it's not that we're not attending school, it's that school is not attending to us, right? We feel unwelcome in this school. We feel like, our teachers aren't responding to us. It's not that we've abandoned school, but school has really abandoned us. And they worked with these young people to tell their story about their experiences of education and how that might be improved. And in the process of doing that, they taught them how to use video cameras and how to record their stories. There was a big sort of oral history project, or storytelling, community storytelling component to it as well. But a very, very powerful study, sort of focusing on these young people's experiences. As Bo said, I've also been really interested in arts-based action research. Fortunately, you can do arts-based action research and have no artistic talent whatsoever. But up in here to your upper left-hand corner, is example of participatory theater. At the same time that Paulo Freire was working in Brazil, there was a guy named Augusto Boal who was developing theater of the oppressed. And it's a way of using theater and drama to help people begin to develop stories and narratives, and to understand a situation or an issue, and oftentimes to then present it publicly as a way of helping people understand the nature of a particular problem. Very powerful process. There's a whole, it's called sometimes forum theater, and there are training workshops if you want to get involved in that, but it's a very powerful process. Puppeteering, this is actually the Squalist Puppeteer Group in my city of Louisville, Kentucky. Puppets can sometimes say things that people can't, which makes them very powerful tools. This is visual arts down here. This is actually our student Sarah Hellman and my colleague Miriam Rader-Roth here in the bottom. One of the things that I'm trying to do, besides being interested in some of this other stuff and ethics, I'm really interested in higher education and trying to change. I don't think that higher education as it currently exists is sustainable. And I'm interested in trying to find ways in which action research we can kind of turn the mirror back on the academy to create change within the academy, rather than thinking that those of us in the academy should always be going out into the community. I think we need to be a little bit more self-reflective and change how the academy works. And one of the things I don't like about the academy is the rhetoric. In the United States anyway, when someone finishes their dissertation, we call it the defense, a dissertation defense, which I always thought sounded like, we're going to put up our dukes and fight it out. And it seemed like a competition or a combat rather than an opportunity to, really appreciate someone's work. So this is a celebration. And we've decided, and this was actually the day we decided this is what we're going to call them from now on. This is Sarah's dissertation celebration. She did a project with young at-risk women where she had them create art, and then she created art based on what she heard from them. They wrote poetry, and her dissertation is this beautiful compilation of all of the artwork that was created as part of her research process. And when she had her dissertation celebration, we had it in an art gallery, and we all made art together and ate, and it was just a beautiful event. So I think art can be a really important part of generating knowledge. And finally, music. That picture on the upper right-hand corner is from the Highlander Research and Education Center in Newmarket, Tennessee, which is recently celebrated their 80th anniversary. Was founded by a guy named Miles Horton and some of his colleagues. And it's really kind of the key site, kind of a site of pilgrimage for those of us in the United States who are doing action research. It was one of the key sites for civil rights training in the American South. And as you can see in this image, this is Martin Luther King and Pete Seeger, who's a famous American folk singer, Cheris Horton, who is the daughter of Miles Horton, Rosa Parks, and Ralph Abernathy at the Highlander Folk School. But a lot of music, things like the song We Shall Overcome in its current form as a song of protest, came out of the Highlander Research Center. So music can be a really important and powerful tool in bringing people together around a cause. Okay, I'm going to hurry through this. Appreciative inquiry. One of the problems, I think, sometimes about doing community-based research is we get stuck in problems and in sort of deficit mode, thinking that there's nothing good about a community. And I think oftentimes, if we want to get funding for research, we've got to make it even worse than it really is, and we reinforce the direness of problems, which is appropriate in some ways. Nobody's saying those problems don't exist, but it overlooks the kinds of strengths and assets that are in communities when we do that. And appreciative inquiry and asset mapping are all about sort of trying to begin by thinking of what in appreciative inquiry they talk about asking the positive question. What's good in this community that we can build upon? So I think it's, again, a really important way of just shifting our frame of reference. Critical utopian action research is actually something invented by your neighbors in Roskilde University, which is a very powerful tool, I think. And I mean, you can read about this work. They've got this is what my friends Dita Tufting and Mia Husted talk about. The role of the research is to be active in the world by creating proposals for new democratic structures in society as a result of their research and findings. And what they have developed is something called future creating workshops. I don't know about you all, but I know the Danes are a lot more patient than Americans. They take 3 days to do these. You couldn't do that in the United States. We wouldn't spend 3 days doing anything. But the idea is you start with like a critique phase, and then there's a utopian phase, and then finally there's a realization phase, looking at a problem. It's a very, very powerful process, and if you're interested, I mean, they're right across, the water there, so call on them. To finish up with a couple more methods, indigenous community-based research. It's a whole family of research methods, really, that are sort of based in trying to honor indigenous communities and the traditions of indigenous communities as part of a research process, rather than imposing Western sort of ideas and processes into indigenous communities. This particular project is one that was done by my friend Michael Kroll, who is looking at youth suicide prevention in the polar region. He started out working with Inuit and has actually worked with Sami people here to look at youth suicide prevention, and then brought all of the young people from right around the polar region together to talk about this and how they might develop solutions together. And I mentioned earlier youth participatory action research. Action research is a global network, there are people doing this in all parts of the world. Like I say, I was recently in the Philippines doing work. People in South Africa that I just met are doing incredible work. It really is happening everywhere. This is my university, Highlander. I'm doing this very quickly because I want to be sure we've got, I was told I don't have to stop right at 5:30, but I do want some time for questions. This is some of the work that's being done in South and Central America, United Kingdom. The Society for Participatory Research in Asia has been around for almost 30 years now. Doing work in India and on the subcontinent, largely on work with women's empowerment and work in the Dalit community. This is the work of my friends in Manila. So let me finish by sort of suggesting to you that if this is something you're interested in, make a point of getting connected. Why would you do that? Well, mutual support. This is a very warm, one of the nice things about action researchers is they're generally very nice people and very welcoming people, and they want to welcome people into the world of action research. There's a lot of resources available, shared learning, redundancy, and by that I mean we need a broad network of people who are involved in this so that, I sometimes use this mushroom metaphor. Did you know, and I realize that Swedes are very into mushrooms, I know this. And I actually had a very nice mushroom risotto last night at Bo and Maria's house. The largest organism in the world is a huge fungus. And I think of action research as being that same way. We kind of are underground, and then we kind of pop up in different places with those beautiful sort of golden mushrooms, but we're taking over. So, having that kind of broad network is really important. So, where can you go to learn more? Well, there's a journal, there's the encyclopedia, we've got a website called Action Research Plus that has a very nice blog. So there's lots of resources. You feel free to email me. So I'll end there, say talk. Let me also say talk to Ray Harryhausen. How many of you know who Ray Harryhausen is? Yes? Isn't he a marvel? Okay, so one final slide. Here's the bonus question, and I'm going to see if you, what's your name? Pablo, if you can answer this question. Why did I choose this picture to start my talk? Oh, you are so good. Well done. Yes, sir. This is the Medea talk. Jason was married to Medea. This is from Jason and the Argonauts. Well done, sir. So, talk, thank you very much. I'm impressed, Pablo.
Okay, thank you very much for this beautiful speech. Any questions or comments, either here and then online? We have shall we start online and privilege those people who've been watching from far away?
So, to start with, you have two questions. First of all, are there any examples from action research that come from non-humanities traditions?
Non-humanities traditions?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff in medical sciences.
Okay.
Nursing, and I mean, the whole community-based participatory research movement is really about improving health kinds of things. And if you think about it, things like citizen science and science shops are very much aligned with action research. So there's a lot of work that's happening outside. In fact, social sciences, medicine, business, international development. I'd say, in fact, the humanities are behind rather than ahead in terms of this.
Okay. And the other question is, does active participatory research have any connection to positive psychology besides sharing a common vision centered on positive global change?
Yes. And where did this come up just recently? I was talking to somebody about positive psychology. Maybe been somebody at this conference. But, I mean, it's interesting. My dad is a clinical psychologist and does a lot of sort of family systems therapy. And one of the things my dad and I we've presented together about how family systems therapy and action research are actually parallel processes, just at different scales. So something like appreciative inquiry, I think, is very tied to positive psychology. I mean, I think they're very integrated. So, I think positive psychology has a real affinity for, I don't know they'd identify themselves as action researchers, but I think a lot of the sort of thinking behind it is very consistent with what we'd be doing. Psychology as a whole has not been very accepting of action research, so maybe the positive psychologists need to all come over and join us. Any other? Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Hi. I am doing a practice-based or practice-led research, PhD research, which comes from artistic research in a way, and uses participation and visualization methods and so on. Now, my question is, so there are many links with action research. In a way, it is action research. What I'm struggling with in my research is if you are looking with such research towards some kind of transformative change, the idea of transformation, change, how do you write about what transformation actually takes place? How can you think of what evidence is? Because in the end, you have to somehow describe or analyze outcomes of such action research. And in my looking around, I've never actually seen anyone pinning down what transformation is. It's a very broad, very big concept. Can you give me some kind of insights that you have about how to talk about evidencing?
I think that's a really good question. And who was it? Somebody recently wrote an article about what kind of evidence, because I think it's a real challenge for us. Is we make all these claims about transformation and change, but how do you support those claims? And I think part of what you need to do is go back to that list of what kind of level of change are we talking about? Are you talking about individual level change, in which case there's one way in which you might document that. You might talk to people or look at sort of evidence from what they're saying or the kind of work that they're producing to see, are there ideas about themselves or are there ideas about the problem changing over time from a more sort of qualitative sort of an data analysis approach. But then, all the way up to, if you're trying to really achieve policy level change, you can document if that's really happened, right? I mean, my dissertation research, which was a study of accessibility needs of people with disabilities, we won a state Supreme Court case. I think that's pretty good evidence, So, if you can sort of, but, it's hard to say this policy resulted from this process, And so I think part of what you need to do is think about, okay, how am I tracking, what's going on, but it is really tricky. Yeah.
It's about creating, if it's about self-reflection or empathy, or how do you pin it down?
Right.
What happens?
Right. Well, I think in ways very similar to the way qualitative researchers would really use the language, the stories, the images that people are talking about, and look for themes across that, and try to sort of pull out what kind of evidence am I hearing, and then I think the other part of the process is to do that not as an individual researcher, but to do that together with people. In the group, what are you hearing together? Yeah. And if you read a lot of accounts of action research, one of the things that we try to do is to document how that process takes place. So I think you might find examples in like some of the literature, like Michael Krall's work on youth suicide prevention. The specific kinds of interventions that they develop. One of which, for instance, is working with elders in the communities to help young people connect up to their own traditions. And you can look at, are young people talking differently about their own hopes for the future, their own connection to community, those kinds of things. Other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I've been very much inspired.
Oh, good.
But I would like you to come back to an issue you raised early on about the systemic change. Because many examples here have been rather narrow in their focus. For example, we look at the picture, an image of refugees and a policeman. They are part of a very big system. It's very hard to take a picture of, let's say, capitalism or imperialism.
Right.
And also, when we think about action, we very often narrow down our scope and limit ourselves because we can do certain things. I can help some immigrant kids learn Swedish, but I can't put an end to the war in Syria.
Right.
So I see this tendency of narrowing things down. And that's what made me interested in your idea about systemic change and sort of that's upscaling.
Right, right. No, I think that's a really good question. It's why I got involved in this idea of systemic action research, because each of us can only do so much, right? But if we can somehow pull together all of those efforts, I think we have some hope of creating larger scale change, but then it means that we have to connect all of that up, and I think Danny's idea for doing this is potentially really powerful. I think the other part that we need to do is think more about root causes, I remember hearing a story once from a woman who was the director of a program I worked for about, you're standing by the river and a basket floats down the river and there's a baby in the basket. So you throw yourself in the river, you grab the basket, you struggle to the shore, you save the baby, and no sooner have you done that than you see two baskets going down the river. I mean, can we just imagine the refugee crisis is exactly this image, right? And you pull those children out of the river. Well, at some point, you've got to go up the river and find out who's throwing the babies in and stop it there. And I think too often we try to sort of deal with problems after the fact, and we need to go back to root causes. And I think, if we're going to be effective in addressing some of these issues, we really need to focus at that level. Sort of working collaboratively to think about, why is there a refugee crisis in Syria? It's one thing to take care of the 190,000 people who are here, but, are there ways of addressing issues or, global climate change? Well, we can try to deal with food insecurity, but what we really need to do is to go back and understand why that is happening and begin to address problems at that level. It can be really overwhelming. One of the things about that fishbone diagram is you look at that and you just think, holy cow, I can't deal with this. If you look at one of those really bony fishes and you think, there's no way I can tackle this problem. But one of the advantages of that particular approach is that then you sort of say, okay, what's one bone? What's one way into this problem that and the group that I'm working with, what's a way into this that we can at least begin to get some traction? So you're not just feeling hopeless and overwhelmed, but it's a real challenge. I think you're right. And until we sort of have those really broad networks that are sort of working together on an issue, I think we're going to have a hard time tackling some of these really tough issues.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I was wondering about the kind of core role that values and ethics play in this research method, especially when you might have conflicting values and ethics. So for example, if you yourself as a researcher, even if you kind of co-create what you establish as your values with the research community that you're studying, what if those come into conflict with fellow academics or colleagues or other people within your institution, especially if you're trying, and what if even if you share values, you differ on your thoughts of what your action should be. And I'm thinking specifically about this concept of having an idea of a utopia that kind of presupposes that everybody has this same utopia that we're all working toward.
Yeah.
So I was wondering how you could address that.
I think that's a really interesting question, one I've actually been thinking about, particularly in terms of the idea of utopia, because, etymologically it means no place, right? But it may mean no one place. The guy that I met in England, a guy named Ronald Barnett, recently wrote a book called Imagining the University. And what Ronald Barnett says, in terms of, this gets back to sort of change in higher education, is that we need to create as many what he calls feasible utopias as possible. So there isn't any one, we're not looking for one utopia. We're looking for as many creative ways of solving a problem or reconceptualizing a system as we can, and then testing those out to sort of see what works. So, I think rather than sort of trying to shut us all down and reach consensus, it's more about opening it up to a range of possibilities, and then, trying to see sort of what works and bringing those aspects together in a more creative whole. So it's a really wonderful book. It actually made me very hopeful. And it was interesting because I read his book about feasible utopias, and I said, he's got a really good idea, and the people at Roskilde University know how to do this. So, it's that critical utopian action research process that I think is really powerful in that regard. Any other questions? I know we're a little bit over time.
But the ethical load on the action researcher is immense. More so when you try to upscale it towards systemic change. Given the limited nature of how much we can achieve, as you have just mentioned. So the question here is, in your subjective opinion, is there potential for a more radical turn in participatory action research towards more irreverence? Because I feel that a majority has a sort of an arrested public imagination when it comes to action, even within the action research community.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. There's a friend of mine, Ortrun Zuber-Skerrit, has written about sort of a spectrum from what she calls sort of technical action research through emancipatory. And I think particularly in my own field of education, a lot of what we do is very technical. It's kind of very narrow, small scale, not big impact. I mean, it solves legitimate problems, or it addresses legitimate problems, but with none of that kind of radical, really, we need to change the world in fundamental ways kind of thinking. And the whole idea of emancipatory action research sort of at the other end is very much about what I think you're talking about really trying to tackle, change on a much more radical revolutionary kind of scale. And if you read people like Paulo Freire or Miles Horton, they, by the way, wrote a beautiful book together called We Make the Road by Walking. That's a dialogue between the two of them. Their thinking is very much, I think, in line with what you're talking about. Was there another
line? Yes.
Okay, so I have a question from Gunther, who asks, participatory action research sounds similar to what Saul Alinsky prescribed in Rules of Radical.
Yes.
And he would like to know as to, do you guys adhere to this belief of change, or is action research more academic, less confrontational?
You can tell Gunther that I organized my entire dissertation reference section so that Saul Alinsky would come first.
So that's an answer. So, but to the radicalism, is the radicalism still there, or?
Well, I think this gets to your point as well. Yes, in some ways. Although, Alinsky was also, there's a space for that kind of confrontation. I think it's really important. But that's not always the way to solve problems, right? Sometimes you want to bring people together. I think he's one really important influence, but that can't be the only way we go about thinking about solving problems. But tell him that book was very influential to me, particularly as a community organizer. So,
okay. And there is another comment,
yes?
From Tobias, who mentions that it's very interesting that we talk about Roskilde and utopia, especially as 25 colleagues recently quit their jobs as part of the budget cuts in Danish higher education. So we need to face some very hard facts about budgets, governments who are fundamentally opposed to science, knowledge, and social change.
Yes. Well, and that gets at my comments about the need for change in higher education. I started out thinking that it was only American universities that were so crazy about rankings and evaluations and students as consumers and student debt, and then I get to South Africa, where all the students had just been rioting because of increases in tuition there and the extent to which that's going to marginalize minority students even further than they are now. And I'm realizing that, you know, we really need to be thinking about radical change in higher education on a global scale, which is sort of what I'm trying to work on now. One of the other talks I gave, this one in South Africa, was called "Changing the World is Easy, Changing the Academy is Hard." So that's going to be the rest of my life's work, I think.
Which sounds like a great finish to this, because in 2 weeks' time we're going to discuss something like this at Medea Live as well, at Medea Talks. So I want to thank you all for coming here. I want to thank you online for being sticking with us, and especially thank you, Mo, for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much.